Achtung, Achtung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland. I'm at the Edinburgh Fringe.
That's why you're sounding a little bit hoarse.
I am, because we started on Monday and I'm not very match fit. So I'm a tiny bit on. We did 2 on the opening night because I'm greedy. Anyway, but we're miracles of technology have allowed us to put this episode together, and I'm very, very excited about talking to our guest today, James. I don't know about you.
Yeah. I mean, I've only just discovered this historian in the last year or so, and I am a massive fan. It's popular narrative non-fiction as it should be. You know, superbly researched, absolutely no stone left unturned. You feel in incredibly good hands. That this is someone who's absolutely done his homework, rolled up his sleeves, and got into the archives and done the hard yards. And yet it's combined with just superb storytelling. And it is amazing because not many people, it has to be said, have that ability to combine those two things. But James M. Scott has done that.
But it's 3 things, Jim, because it's also this essential moral question at the heart of this part of the campaign, which is the sort of the meat at the heart of the story. Anyway.
Yes, so the new work that James has done is Black Snow, which is Curtis LeMay, The Firebombing of Tokyo and the Road to the Atomic Bomb. And this is B-29s over Japan at the latter end of 1944 and into the spring of 1945, culminating with these minutes just after midnight on the 10th of March, where comparatively few heavy bombers in the big scheme of compared to what you're sending over to over the ETO, for example, are causing just unbelievable devastation. But I'm sort of jumping the gun there. But I should also say, James has also written books about the Tokyo raid, Doolittle raid, about US submarines in the war against Japan, and also a book which I absolutely love, which is called Rampage, which we've referenced a number of times, about the Battle for Manila in January to March 1945, which I thought was just stupendously good as well. So
let's welcome into the podcast then, rather than talk.
Yeah, you are allowed to speak as well, James.
Well, I was just listening and enjoying you guys bantering on.
Well, banter is what it's all about.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it.
James, this story of the firebombing of Tokyo is always where that's the centre of this story, and then the subsequent firebombing of Japanese cities. It's a story that's been overshadowed, hasn't it? By the use of the atomic bombs. Is that what drew you to it? The fact that it's not been sort of erased from the historic record, but it's kind of been glossed over.
It absolutely has. No, and that's the thing. You look at what happened in Tokyo on the night of March 9th, early morning of March 10th. I mean, 16 square miles of the city are burned, 105,000 people killed. I mean, just staggering destruction. And you ask people about that and they're like, they don't know anything about it. But everybody knows Hiroshima, everybody knows Nagasaki. And so this whole campaign just kind of gets sort of glossed over. And of course, let's be honest, 1945 is a very hectic time in the Pacific. I mean, you've got Iwo Jima, you've got Okinawa, you've got Manila, then you have the atomic bombs and all. I mean, there's just so much going on. But you're absolutely right. This story of this just insane raid just gets sort of lost in that mix.
But also within that, but when it does come up in conversation, it's sort of brutal, badass Curtis LeMay, who's the sort of bomber commander, sending these guys over. Did we really need to do it? Did we need to kind of sort of take it? You know, this was the Americans who've kind of, you know, they're really into precision daylight bombing and they have their morals and they don't want to do kind of, you know, carpet bombing, and here they are completely turning that on their head and just slaughtering innocent Japanese. And what I hadn't appreciated was how, you know, it's inevitably it's not as straightforward as that. And one of the big things which I hadn't appreciated at all was just how tricky a place this is to bomb. Not in terms of the distance from, you know, Saipan or wherever, the bases and Tinian, but the weather. The weather over, you know, like 4 days in a month where you've actually got visibility.
Oh, yeah.
Whoever knew?
It's horrible for bombers. I mean, there are some days where you have 3 days of visibility. And if you're trying to do daylight precision bombing, it simply won't work, because not only do you have such limited days, you have to predict when those days are going to be. And there's no way you can do that. And then you add on top of that nobody understood until they started bombing, was that Japan has these incredible jet streams up in the heavens, that are blowing at 200 miles per hour, which just totally wreck bombing accuracy. And then on top of that, you've got these massive distances that these air crews are flying, 1,500, 1,600 miles one way just to Tokyo. They're flying in a B-29, which is a revolutionary new plane, but at this point in the war is prone to lots of problems, engine fires, things like that. So you just have, and then of course the Japanese are flying raids against the Mariana Islands from Iwo Jima. And so really all of these things kind of combine to make this just an incredibly daunting bombing operation in late 1944, in the early stages of this campaign.
And so much capital. I mean, not just money, but sort of inter-service political capital has been spent on this campaign, hasn't it? That the Air Force is desperate to prove that first of all, that it needs to be all these people like Hap Arnold and Billy Mitchell are all mobilised around the idea of the Air Force being its own thing and separating from the Army. And one thing that really struck me is the B-29 gets off to a bad start. They really have to work hard to get the airplane viable. The bombing gets off to a bad start. They have to find a solution to that problem as well. And that so much of this is driven by people. I came to wondering if they were trying to win the war or win those battles, political battles and military-industrial complex battles, as we'd call them now. And that the war is winning the war is a byproduct of the Air Force proving itself, and Arnold proving himself right about the B-29 project, which he'd staked everything on.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is. I mean, the B-29 cost about $3.7 billion, making it the single most expensive weapon system for the U.S. during the war. I mean, it cost more money than the atomic bomb. I mean, putting this revolutionary bomber into production, I mean, America put it into production before they even knew if it could fly. And of course, on one of its early test flights, it crashes into a Seattle meatpacking plant.
And so it's not a good moment, is it?
Oh, it is, And so, I mean, in order to build this bomber in the quantity needed to fight this war, I mean, the United States actually built an entire city in Kansas just to house this army of workers. I mean, they had to build schools, movie theaters for entertainment and everything. So, I mean, there's all this capital that's gone into it. And of course, as you noted, all this is because there's, Hap Arnold's lifelong quest has been to prove that the Air Service should be separate from the Army. And in order to prove that, he needs the Air Force to own a share of victory. And of course, he's fighting against the Navy right here because, so much, the U.S. Army kind of has its domain staked out in Europe. And so the Navy has really staked out its territory in the Pacific. And Hap Arnold is kind of right there. So you've got this huge inter-service rivalry between the Navy and the Army Air Service as well. So, I mean, all these competing interests at the exact same time.
But you have those, but there is something bigger going on here, which is this notion of steel, not flesh, this idea of using mechanization. I mean, air power is absolutely central to the United States war aims, just as it is for Britain as well. And one of the main reasons for that is because, if you can get bombers to come over and do a lot of the hard yards, then you don't have to have a slaughter of a generation like you did in the First World War, which still has an impact on the United States as well, although obviously a much more kind of violent impact on Britain and obviously France and whatever. But the point of it is to make life easier for the troops on the ground, isn't it? Is if you can destroy the means of waging war, then that lessens their ability to wage war, which then means that the infantrymen who've got to jump out of landing craft or have got to kind of sort of get across Luzon or whatever, are in theory going to have an easier time with things. And broadly speaking, that proves to be true. I mean, an infantryman or a marine on Peleliu or Iwo Jima might have a different view of that. But overall, the numbers of people that are actually in the firing line is comparatively small compared to service troops and CBs and supply people and people driving trucks and people baking airfields, out of crushed coral or whatever it might be. And there's no question, surely, that the strategic air campaign does have a massive benefit to the Allies' war effort. It's just that it's not the complete effort. It doesn't singularly create victory on its own. It's a massive contribution, and I don't think anyone would doubt the contribution of Allied air power to the eventual victory. It's just, it's not in its own right. That's the point.
Yeah, and it was sold during the lead up to World War II as this sort of panacea, this idea that you can kind of come in and you could collapse either the German or the Japanese economy like this house of cards by picking a few key industries. And of course, all the rubber meets the road when the war begins. And so, and as air power is the air war against Germany is a slog. I mean, it goes on year after year. And Arnold then shifts his focus to the Pacific, which is, okay, I've got a second opportunity, another bite at this apple. I can show that we can knock Japan out of this war before we have to do what we had to do in Manila, or before we have to do what we had to do on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And I think particularly about 45, you're really just seeing, the violence in the Pacific during that time period is so extreme. I mean, we talked a little bit about Rampage and the Battle of Manila. 100,000 people killed in 29 days. The creativity,
mostly by the Japanese,
urban bloodletting, mostly by the Japanese, and the creativity that went into that kind of siege warfare. It's like out of medieval times, in fortresses, turning skyscrapers into fortresses.
I was just watching the first episode of House of Dragons the other day, and I was seeing, Daemon sends his police out and they go and slaughter everyone. And, and I was thinking, this is Manila. It's kind of actually not that different, really, is it? It really isn't. People with swords hacking innocent people to death. That's what was going on in Manila in kind of February 1945, and it was an absolute horror story. I suppose, one of the things that Al and I have talked a lot about on this podcast over the last couple of years is this kind of fear of having to invade the Japanese home islands, which starts to kind of pervade everything. We see what happens in Peleliu. It's supposed to be a matter of days, and it takes kind of 10 weeks, and it's just a total, nightmare to beat all nightmares. Then you've got Iwo Jima. Then you've got, as you say, Manila. Then you've got Okinawa, in April to June. And the closer you get to Japan, the more beaten the Japanese are, the harder they fight, the more brutal, the more violent the fighting is. And so you can understand why, from an ally point of view and from a US point of view, you're just thinking the last thing we flipping want to do is be fighting through cities or any territory at all on the Japanese home islands. So, yeah, okay, we were all really into kind of daylight bombing, precision bombing, but it isn't working. And what's the alternative? It's horrible that we're going to have to do this and destroy these cities. But if it's kind of our boys or Japanese, we didn't pick this fight in the first place, that would be the argument, then that's the brutal choice we have to make.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's an oversimplification, I think, that happens a lot when they just say, well, LeMay makes this decision that he's going to burn Japan, and it's just this 180-degree reversal. When the reality is, America had actually been planning for this for a while. We realized when the war begins, we're like, all right, we need to come up with a new flame weapon. Therefore, napalm is invented.
Yeah, napalm.
It's first tested on the soccer field at Harvard, and then, all right, well, if we're going to make realistic tests, we need to build a mock Japanese village out in the deserts of Utah in the summer of 1943, and then let's burn it down repeatedly and test it. So at the same time, war planners are picking apart Japanese cities and by how flammable they are. So much so that, they actually brought in, after the big 1923 earthquake and fire that burns up Yokohama and Tokyo, the War Department goes out and finds the insurance adjusters from that fire to ask them questions and interview them about, like, hey, what was your experience like? What made Tokyo so flammable? So then they prepare these huge dossiers on every single city there, literally breaking them down by, flammable district by flammable district, And so when LeMay does make this decision, he's got a brand new bomb that has been tested on a mock Japanese city, and he's got a file folder on every single city that lays out precisely where to aim and what to do. All he has to do is implement it. And so, it's the pressure for America to move into the firebombing phase had really been building up. It had been building up on LeMay's predecessor, Haywood Hansel, who had refused to do it and ultimately was fired.
So he's really interesting. I mean, tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about him because
he's a fascinating character.
Because he sort of personifies the switch, doesn't he? The switch from trying to do it in a sort of moral,
kind of inverted commas ethical way,
moral way, tell us who he is and
he's part of the Bombermen as well, isn't he?
Correct. Yeah. And that's one of the things I really like about this story is you have really three dominant personalities at play here. You've got Haywood Hansel, you've got Curtis LeMay, and you have Hap Arnold, who's the head of the Army Air Service. And of course, Hap Arnold is one of my favorites in that, here he is as head of the Army Air Force, of course, commanding this massive global strike force. But he actually learned how to fly from the Wright brothers.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
The whole reason that early aviators wore goggles was because Hap Arnold got hit in the eye with a bug when he was landing. So he literally goes from like having his Sunday dinners in Ohio with Orville and Wilbur Wright to commanding this. And so he's sort of the presiding figure. And then you've got Haywood Hansel, who's his former chief of staff, who is one of the bomber mafia, one of the guys that between World War I and World War II came up with and preached this gospel of precision bombing and, economies collapsing and things of that nature. And he is a true believer. He's also a member of the American Army aristocracy. His father had been an army surgeon. His family had fought all the way from every revolutionary war.
And he's a devout Christian as well, isn't he? Is that right?
Yes. I think he's Episcopalian, as I recall.
Yeah.
And so he's just, he is a true believer, an acolyte of precision bombing. And he, of course, goes to the war in Europe, and it exposes all of his flaws, not only in his thinking, but also really in his ability as a commander. Because he is, at heart, he's a war planner. He is not a predator. And when you put him in that situation, it's a struggle for him. One of his subordinates is this young guy named Curtis LeMay, who's this dark-haired, quiet guy who turns out to be this really terrific combat commander who is everything that Hansel is not. Yep. He grew up dirt poor in Ohio. He put himself through college by working all night in a steel mill.
Yes,
he's got an
that's
engineering
amazing.
background.
I mean, this is incredible because he's working from kind of 5 p.m. till 4 or something every night, isn't he? And then getting up and doing his studies. And because he's a little bit over, because he's been skipping the first lesson in the morning because he's got to get some sleep at some point, he's 10% short of his degree, which he then subsequently finishes later while he's in the Air Force. I mean, Jesus, I mean, talk about commitment. I mean,
he's
impressive.
He's got an incredible work ethic. He's just dogged. And the thing about LeMay too is that, like, if you read his personal letters, I mean, his work during World War II come at tremendous personal sacrifice. I mean, he's constantly writing about how tired he is. He's in his 30s at this point. He's a young guy, but he's writing home to his wife. He's like, when this war ends, I'm going to sleep forever.
And his letters to his wife are very short, aren't they? And she complains.
Oh yeah, I mean, they're like a paragraph long.
Yeah,
he's like, somebody's got to defeat the Germans.
Just stay at home and keep the home fires burning, and I'll get on with winning the war. Yeah, it's amazing.
One of the things that struck me about him from the book, James, is this sort of that he's a brainwave guy, that he'll sit and wait and figure out and not sleep and mull over an idea, and then suddenly the solution pops into his head. So the thing of the German flak gun being able to zero in you in 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Tell us that, because that's an extraordinary sort of man having a moment of inspiration.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, and that, again, it gets back to LeMay's engineering mindset. He's a problem solver. And so, of course, he gets over to England in 42. And, of course, all the American pilots are saying, hey, if you fly a straight course for 10 seconds, you're toast. And so he goes, he managed to bring his artillery manual from ROTC at Ohio State all the way with him over there. And he goes by and he starts calculating. He realizes that, like, these are made up numbers, and that it's going to take the Germans, far, far longer to be able to calculate exactly where they are, sight their guns and all that. And he really kind of dispels that myth. And he tells his guys, and he says, but like so much of LeMay does, he says, I'm not going to send you up there to do it. I'll fly in front.
Yeah,
I will show you that I'm going to do it. He's like a Jimmy Doolittle. There are certain commanders that if they're going to send you to do this, they're going to do it with you, and they're going to be at the front. And, of course, he does that. He does the same thing with bomber formations. Of course, everybody thought the B-17 was going to be this aerial, workhorse that was not, the fighters were not going to be able to get it. Of course, all that's wrong. So he's figures out how to align his bombers in such a way to maximize the defensive nature of it. So he's always a troubleshooter like that. And of course, his superior at that time is Haywood Hansel. In fact, in LeMay's personnel files, Hansel actually wrote a commendation letter thanking him for all of his hard work. And so these two guys, they're working together, and they're completely different types of individuals, completely different types of commanders, working together in Europe. And then, of course, their roles flip when it comes to the Pacific.
I suppose the big question is why is Haywood Hansel sent out to take charge of the B-29s and the bombing of Japan when he is? Because you'd have thought by that point people would have seen his strengths and weaknesses and realised that he's not the right man. Particularly if they're also back in the States. You're kind of planning how to napalm a Japanese city. That suggests that the Hansel way is kind of is not the way that they're now thinking.
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that he had a close relationship with Hap Arnold. He had worked, and the air service was small at that point. Of course, during World War II, it explodes in size and whatnot. But he had come up during that interwar period when it was small. And Arnold took a whole bunch of these young men under his wing, so to speak, and, kind of nurtured them. And Hansel was one of them. And he'd served as his chief of staff. And so you
send someone you trust.
You send somebody you trust, you like him. Everybody would say he's a really smart guy. He's a thinker and all that. But by the time he gets out to the Pacific, the job isn't about thinking. The job is about operating and performing. And that's where he can't do it.
Right. Yeah.
He runs into all these obstacles that we talked about, the air, the clouds, the jet streams, the Japanese raids from Iwo Jima. Of course, the bases aren't built out. The runways aren't fully done, the hard stands and whatnot. And it overwhelms him.
And there's also, there's troublesome but brilliant and highly respected bomber leaders below him, who are his subordinates. I think it's O'Donnell. Is it O'Donnell?
Yeah, Rosie O'Donnell.
Rosie O'Donnell, who's clearly a brilliant combat leader, but is just absolutely chalk and cheese with Hansel, and is going over there saying, we're kind of busting our ass to go over to Tokyo. We're getting attacked by lots of fighters, and we're achieving diddly squat. This is a complete waste of time. This is simply not going to work in these conditions. It's all very well having your highfalutin kind of ethics about precision bombing, but if it's A, not very precise, and B, not very effective, and all that's happening is we're losing B-29s and frankly, more importantly, crews, then this is the wrong route to go, isn't it? But Hansel is so kind of evangelical about it. He's like sort of la la la. I'm not listening.
I mean, at this point, it becomes this fixation, this obsession for him that he can't adjust his thinking in order to say, all right, it's not working. I need a different way to problem solve here. And he just can't do it because he's so married to his strategy that he developed and whatnot. And he's convinced that if he's just given more time, he can break through. And yet sometimes you just can't solve that equation with the tools you're given. And that's it. And O'Donnell, of course, and one of the things I found fascinating going through O'Donnell's papers is he had binders of all the letters he wrote to all the families of the airmen who didn't come back.
Yeah, you were saying something like 1,200 or something. I mean, that's
1,200 pages of these things. I mean, and so, he was flying these missions with his men, through all of Japan's flak, through their fighters, dealing with that. And his diary, likewise, is just filled with how angry he was and hostile he was to Hansel for blaming him for this stuff. So, and of course, all this leads to Hap Arnold saying, you know what? Finally, he realizes I've got the wrong guy for this job right now, and he lets him go. And that's when he brings in LeMay. And of course, LeMay is the combat operator. And but to LeMay's credit, and there's this meeting because you have to remember, LeMay and Hansel know each other. They're friendly. And so when LeMay lands there on Guam at this point in early 45, and he's told he's going to replace Hansel, you can imagine sort of this awkward face-to-face moment. And of course, Hansel's always the gentleman. Of course, he loves Shakespeare. He loves writing poetry. He's just this polite Southern gentleman. And of course, he says to LeMay, I don't blame you for this. I recognize what's going on, but I'm going to caution you. He says, we will be remembered not for whether we win the war, because we're going to win it, but we will be remembered for how we win the war. And he admonishes him to stay with daylight precision bombing. And LeMay responds back and says, look, that's the doctrine, that's the strategy. I'm going to do that until it doesn't work. And so LeMay, a lot of people say, well, LeMay comes in, immediately America's tactics change. And that's not really true. I mean, LeMay comes in.
He adds lots of training, doesn't he? But he still sends out daylight raids to start off with.
Exactly. He takes what Hansel's doing, and he tinkers with it. He's remember, he's a problem solver. He's like, all right, we'll bring the bombers down from 30,000 feet to 25,000 feet. We'll move what time takeoffs are. We'll improve training. We'll improve maintenance. We'll beef up our radar operators' capabilities. But time and again, the results are the same. He cannot break through. He cannot get bombs on target. And that's when the pressure is continuing to build on him from Washington. Of course, at this time period, the Battle of Manila is literally winding down. I mean, that's the backdrop of all this, the bloodshed in the Philippines. Yep. And that's when LeMay says, okay, I need a new variable in this equation. I got to change this whole equation.
And so he has another brainwave, doesn't he? To fly low at night with incendiaries and to attack. I mean, what's interesting is about the Akasuka part of Tokyo that he decides to attack is all the cottage industry, and this is another thing that I was really struck by, because after all, we here in the UK, whenever you talk about strategic bombing, it always comes back to Dresden. The Dresden is the sort of watermark of the British strategic bombing campaign,
which we just simply seem incapable of getting past. It always comes up.
Which Hamburg is really worse in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. But what's and then Hamburg is whenever anyone brings up Dresden, I say, well, what do you know about what about Hamburg, where there's a firestorm 2 years earlier, 45,000 people killed, and it is a major industrial and trade, a port. It's an obvious target. But what I didn't realize about Japanese industry is it's so decentralized and relies so much on workshops and people's foundries in their, essentially on their own property, that you can attack a residential area and it's an industrial area, and that sort of distinction that the RAF, because the RAF do their dehousing, as they like to call it, because all of this is cloaked in euphemism. That was the thing that I was really struck by is that Japan is. You could argue that this is an industrial target, this residential area, by virtue of the way it's full of workshops and people's smithies and stuff.
Absolutely, it is. I mean, literally 50% of Tokyo's production comes from these types of factories. And these are tiny. A lot of these employ 5 people or less. They're making like the pin for a hand grenade or the trigger for a rifle. It's these tiny little parts. And of course, Japan has no real sense of zoning like we have in modern countries today, where you have all your industrial area in one, your residential in another, and commercial in another. I mean, it's all intermixed, and it's just this huge sea of rooftops, and it's just a workshop downstairs, a house above, right next to your corner grocery mart and your everything else, and so it's all intermixed like that, and so that really does. I mean, that is ultimately what LeMay sets his sights on, and of course, at the same time, his target area includes all that. It's also largely, it's like 87% residential. So, I mean, it is a huge residential area as well. But for Tokyo, there's really no greater example out of Japan for that cottage industry mix than Tokyo. I mean, that is where it's dominant. And that's what he sets his sights on.
And it's the capital city, of course, and it's the seat of government, isn't it, and everything. I mean, it's
politics, culture. Everything goes through Tokyo. And in fact, they brought in when they were analyzing whether or not to hit Tokyo, they brought in this guy who was an OSS officer who'd spent time there, and he said, Tokyo, he said, beyond just its fact it's the seat of government, seat of banking, seat of industry, university, and all that, it's the psychology of Tokyo. Everywhere throughout Japan, Tokyo has you knock Tokyo out, it will have a psychological impact throughout the nation. And so, and they're absolutely right on that.
We're sort of getting close to to talking about the fateful night. I mean, LeMay's been in post, a couple of months, less than 7 weeks, hasn't he? At this point, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And what is the response of the crews when they say, "Okay, right, we're now going to attack at night. We're going to go low level, and we're going to try this thing called napalm"?
Oh, they're horrified. Because, for all this time, they've been flying, the lowest is about 25,000 feet, but often up at 30,000 feet. And that distance is their safety net because the fighters can't get up there. It's harder for the flak. I mean, it is that safety line. And here LeMay is saying, I'm going to take you from way up here in the heavens all the way down to just a little bit above rooftop, just under a mile. And we're going to send you into the enemy's capital city. It's like kicking a hornet's nest.
So what height are they told that they're going to go in?
They range from about 5,000 to 8,000 feet. And so he has to stagger.
That is really low, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. He has to stagger everybody so there aren't any collisions. Yeah. So they go in as low as 5,000 feet. They take some of the guns off the plane so they can free up more weight in order to be able to carry more bombs. They literally they take away the defensive formations. They're going to go in singly and whatnot. But LeMay, and people are saying it's a suicide mission. His own artillery officers are telling him you're going to lose 70% of your force. I mean, that's like 2,000 lives, 200 bombers. But LeMay is, again, he's a problem solver, and he says, I'm not a gambler. He says I take calculated risks. He's like, I've looked at our reconnaissance photography. I'm not seeing low altitude guns. They don't have good night fighters, hardly at all. And plus, for all these months we've been flying all the way up here, during the day, if we come in at night and low, it is going to be a sucker punch. And that is what he's gambling on, that element of surprise.
Tactical surprise.
Totally.
Because if you can achieve tactical surprise, you hold all the aces.
Bingo. And that's exactly what he's really gambling with there. And so he kind of, he sits through these meetings that afternoon and the guys are yelling, this is suicide, and whatnot. He just sitting there smoking a cigar. Like, nope, I've made it. I've taken that risk. I get it. That said, he stresses out more on this mission than he ever has. He's up all night. He doesn't go to bed. He's literally roaming the operations center. He literally goes back to his quarters, gets a soft drink. I mean, it's weighing on him. He does understand that there are significant risks in this operation.
How ready are the Japanese in Tokyo for a raid of this kind? I mean, what are the civil defenses? I mean, what are there in terms of air raid shelters and this kind of stuff?
It's terrible. And it's astonishing that here we are in 1945 and the Japanese have not learned any lessons out of the European theater on this. They put no money into developing any kind of public shelter system. I mean, they basically give out blueprints to all the residents and say, you can dig this little foxhole in your yard. But, when it's 2,000 degrees, that thing isn't going to do any good. So, they really don't, their fire department is way below standards where it should be. They're really relying on neighborhood block associations to try and fight fires using bags of sand and buckets of water, like relay systems. So, they're just woefully, and quite frankly, they deserve a lot of the blame for how bad the situation becomes because they simply had not prepared. And it's astonishing considering where we are in the war at this point and what has happened in Europe.
And how Tokyo is constructed. I mean, it's not like it's a stone city of wide boulevards, is it?
No, it's a wood pile. Their construction, their density. I mean, Asakusa is 135,000 people per square mile. I mean, packed in there. Their architectural standards is 98% wood and paper. They have their average street distances are about 12 feet, like an alleyway. So there's no fire breaks. It has, for a major metropolitan city, it has like 2% of its space is given over to parks. So once a fire starts, there's nothing to stop it.
But it's striking in a way that they haven't learned from the earthquake, because it's a fire that leave what's gone on in the Western theatre out of this. That their own experience of urban disaster tells them that they need fire breaks in the city, and that it is a tinderbox. It seems. I mean, obviously, the Japanese government has got other things on its mind than protecting its population, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly, and that's the thing is, like, America learned more from the 1923 earthquake and fire than Japanese leaders did. And initially after that earthquake and fire, they did try to change their building standards and they did try to add some more park spaces and whatnot. But they abandoned those efforts pretty quickly once a recession set in and building materials became scarce. And they just fell back on what they had done for over centuries, which is the same type of architecture, the same type of building materials. And again, they simply rebuilt this wood pile that LeMay would take advantage of.
I mean, the night of the raid on the ground, though, is it's and a lot of the flyers describe it as a scene for Dante, don't they? A lot of the airmen call it that. I mean, the accounts of the firestorm on the ground are absolutely diabolical. They are scenes straight from hell, aren't they?
They absolutely are, and they. And that was a part of the story I really wanted to tell, because that's a part of the story I don't think gets enough attention in the previous literature on this, is what was it like for those Japanese civilians there. And so I spent time in Tokyo when I was doing my research, doing interviews. And one of the things that really stood out was how loud it is that it's like a freight train. The burning, it's like a freight train. And of course, in the superheated air, it becomes like literally people's clothing begins to burn. Their hair catches on fire. I mean, your eyelashes singe and burn. And so
just from the heat in the air.
Just from the heat in the air. And so people would douse themselves with water out of firefighting cisterns and their clothes would dry right away. And so, and of course, all these foxhole type shelters, provided no protection when the temperatures rose as high as literally 2,800 degrees in some spots. It's hot enough that concrete breaks down, that asphalt liquefies, that the coins in people's pockets fuse together. And so a lot of people then took shelter in sort of the handful of concrete structures like train stations and schools and things like that and whatnot. And initially, those do provide shelter. And they're looking out and they can see the fires devouring the neighborhoods around them. And then the heat gets so intense that the glass in the windows begins to melt and the sparks start to pour in. And of course, a firestorm, one of the trademark things about it is the wind, because all that hot air is escaping upward and it creates this vacuum. And so all this colder air rushes in from the sides. And those wind speeds can be like hurricane force winds. So those winds start blowing into these buildings, and then hallways and staircases become like chimneys. And so literally afterwards, you would find an auditorium of a school where everybody had been reduced to just ashes and bones and an occasional metal helmet that was left. I mean, they were calculating helmets and buttons and trying to figure out how many people had died in certain places. And so it really is, the experience on the ground is just horrifying for those people that live through it. And of course, the airmen are not far above. Here they are just a few thousand feet above. Their bombers are being battered by this. These thermal updrafts are just pounding on them. It's like being in a boxing ring. And of course, as their bomb bay doors are open, they're pulling in all this smoke and air from down below, and they can smell it. They can smell barbecuing flesh. The horses, the dogs, the moms, and the dads. And so, as Captain Charles Phillips later said, quote, "It was the smell of death." And so, and for so long, these bombers have been separated by miles between themselves and their targets, and here they are just literally getting battered by it and able to even smell it. So it's a really intense experience.
It's just, and the descriptions you write of it are, that they make uncomfortable reading. It has to be said. It's incredibly graphic, it's incredibly graphic, and it's a very strange thing, because on one level it's completely unimaginable, and yet you are there with the Japanese civilians down below, and so you sort of can imagine it, and it is absolutely horrific, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is. And again, that's the experience I wanted to communicate that. Because when I started this project, that's what I was like, what was that like? What is it like to survive a firestorm like that? And it really comes down to luck. That's the thing, there's no, how people lived and how people died really came down to their own physiology, where they were. Because you had some cases like this one guy, for instance, was in a bathroom in a school where literally they were dousing themselves with the water from the toilet tanks and whatnot. And of course, everybody passes out because all the oxygen just vanishes and the toxic fumes. And the next day he actually wakes up, and here he is with 36 people, and he's the only one who lived. It's like, what made him live and somebody else died?
Yeah.
One woman I interviewed, she got caught in this firestorm. And so her father kind of draped himself over like a cape almost. And what happened is a lot of times as the fire exceeded, people huddled together, like in the middle of a street, because the buildings on both sides, for example, would be burning. And so they would be in the center of a street and they would huddle together. And what had happened is she ends up in the bottom of this big huddle. And the next morning, her father pulls her out, and everybody that's on top of them had just been carbonized. Yet they had been in this cocoon of bodies underneath everybody and survived. And so it's like, why did some people survive? Why did others not?
It must have been astonishing to talk to her. What was her? How was she all these years later talking about it? Was it?
She was terrific. And she gave me so much of her time. We had dinner. We interviewed for hours. And that was one of the things I found, is that so many of these survivors just were so generous with their time with me. And I'll never forget another one of them, Mrs. Nagata. She had evacuated outside the city. And so Japan actually evacuated 3rd through 6th graders outside the city. And so she was in a temple, and of course her parents and every family were all in Tokyo, and they were all wiped out. And she still had the last letter she'd ever received from her sister. And she brought that to our interview. And her sister had actually seen, LeMay had flown a test raid shortly before the big one in Tokyo. And says Mrs. Nagata's sister had seen that. And she wrote a letter saying, I could never say this, I get in trouble for saying this, but it was so beautiful. They were like sparklers. And of course, that would be the last communication she ever had from her family.
Wow.
And so, it's just these heart-wrenching stories about it. And so, but I was so grateful that folks were so willing to share that with me so I could include it in this history.
And James, tell me, there is a sort of, there's a ongoing debate about the culpability of ordinary German people as to what happened. Firstly with with letting Hitler get away with it. Secondly, their part in the Holocaust, all the rest of it. Where do you think Japanese civilians sit in all this? How much are they answerable for, the government, for Tojo, for the kind of warped Bushido mantra, for Hirohito, all the rest of it? Where do they lie in this? Because one of the features, of course, of the Japanese war is their own brutality towards their enemies. Whether we be talking about the rape of Nanking and just the absolutely appalling treatment of the Chinese to Allied POWs to literally to Filipinos to whoever happened to sort of get in their way. Where do Tokyoans, is that the right word? Tokyoans? Yeah. where do they sit in all this? What's your judgment?
And that's a great question, and one I've not put a lot of thought into. And you're right. One of the things I've always wrestled with is I lived in Japan, and so here you have this culture that prides itself on the tea ceremony and on flower arranging and whatnot. All these things that are just moments of beauty and whatnot, and yet on the flip side of that coin is just ultimate savagery, like Manila and things like that. And in Tokyo, of course, Japan is a democracy really in name only, and that people can vote, but it's a handful of individuals that are really driving so much of Japan's policy in World War II. And by that point in the war, the average civilian, and I've got this great quote, actually, one of the Filipino diplomats who was there in Tokyo has this wonderful diary about it, and said that the average Japanese person at that point just had their head down because life in Japan had become such a struggle that the daily caloric intake had plummeted. There wasn't any food left. The submarine blockade had cut off, the importation of everything.
Well, 88% of GDP is spent on war.
Yeah, and so the average people are like picking flowers and greens out of cemeteries to eat. And so most of the average people were just like their heads down, focusing on day-to-day survival, waiting for this war to end. And it kind of oblivious to some extent to it all because they're so focused on their individual survival. And you really do begin to see that sort of social fabric unraveling, particularly when the firebombs all begin. And you just suddenly, there's like this alarm bell goes off and you see this mass evacuation from the cities. You really see the hollowing out of all of Japan's urban areas and then this burdening on the countryside and whatnot as well. So it has this just cataclysmic effect on their society.
But what effect does it have on the Japanese government? Because after all, this is a raid unprecedented in its scale, its devastation, and also a plain demonstration of Japanese vulnerability, and that they've lost it. If there's an air war, they've lost it.
It should have had a bigger effect than it did.
Well, that's what's curious about it, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it really should have. And it was just, it's amazing to me when you look at it because, the submarine war has really actually killed Japan's economy by the summer of 1944. They've really kind of reached the point where they're beginning the death spiral. But it's hard for people to visualize defeat just through the lack of imports and whatnot. And so the fire raids bring that reality home in a visceral way because suddenly you have burned cities, you have bloated bodies in rivers, you have horror. And it illustrates that level of defeat. But it's surprising that after that March raid, nothing more happens to that level. You don't see a rush to the to wanting to surrender and to negotiate and things like that. In fact, it goes on for several months after this. LeMay, he just keeps on punching city after city after city. I mean, Tokyo, this raid burned 16 square miles. This is only one of only 6 raids against Tokyo. By the end of May, 56 square miles of Tokyo are gone. All right. Manhattan Island is 21 square miles. So literally almost 3 times the size of Manhattan Island are gone. And it's not until the summer of 45 that Hirohito finally says, hey, I think we ought to really actually begin talking about a diplomatic way out of this war. So, and that actually stuns. I mean, you have General Marshall saying, that when he's talking about the atomic attack later on, he's like, we would have thought that the firebombing of Tokyo would have had some sort of political wake-up call that we would have been able to see or whatnot. And it didn't.
Yeah. And
so it is pretty astonishing that, it's just this callousness of the leadership towards their people to allow this to continue.
But there is sort of a warning mood from Europe, isn't there? When the chiefs of staff get together, there is this idea. Well, look, we did this to the Germans, and they fought to the bitter end, and we had to take. We in the end the war had to go to the German capital. And the Air Force sees this as its moment, doesn't it? In the summer, right? Okay, now we've really got to put our foot in the gas and win the war. And LeMay, of course, doesn't know about the atomic bomb until the last minute, and he meets Groves, and Groves takes him through what they've done, and LeMay can't figure out the engineering, even though he has an engineering background. He can't get his head around it. All that stuff, which is absolutely fascinating. But there is this sense to say to the airmen, look, it didn't work in Germany. What you're doing is incredible and brutal and hugely effective, but political will is a different thing.
Yeah, and that's it. And in Japan, I mean, the political will is controlled by like half a dozen people.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing is like, you have this entire country that's being totally decimated, but the decision to be made to get out of the war really falls to about as many people as are on our Zoom almost. I mean, it really is that small of a group. And, and here all this massive amount of pressure is being applied to the civilians. You're dehousing, you're emptying out your cities, you're burning, your food is vanishing and all this kind of stuff. Like, how much can you allow your civilians to suffer before you decide to end it? And that's
I think it's just extraordinary. I mean, one of the things that the Allies made clear in the bombing against Germany is you stop the war, we'll stop the bombing. I mean, you have it in your power to stop this tomorrow. I mean, it's over. We're not going to obliterate cities if the war's over. You're not going to win. And this is the extraordinary thing. I mean, you think about almost any other war. I mean, wars usually end because one side isn't going to win and it's run out of money. Well, I mean, that situation has been achieved for Nazi Germany, when Barbarossa fails in the autumn of 1941, and that has been achieved certainly by the time Guadalcanal's over. It's just not going to happen.
No, but they kind of had this idea that if we could just get one more victory, we get a better position at the bargaining table. And what they really wanted to do, I mean, Hirohito is desperate to hold on to his throne. Yeah. In the latter part of the war, he's having all his the sacred mirror and sword and all this kind of stuff brought to the palace and guarded. I mean, it really comes down to protecting that position.
Yeah.
And at the great cost.
Totally reprehensible, isn't it? I mean, and he just gets away with it. He gets away with it. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
And, that's a whole different podcast, getting into and everything else. But you're absolutely right. It is, and it's so crazy that they had so much of Japan's thinking throughout the Pacific was just outdated. It was if we just get this one great big, naval victory, it'll be like World War I and we'll win. And of course, there is this great big naval victory. It's called Midway and they lost it, But it's hey, submarines aren't really good as independent operators. We'll make them part of the fleet. Never mind the fact that the submarines are one of the most vicious forms of commerce raiders out there. All their thinking was you always say you fight your thinking is about the last war you fought. I mean, and you see that over and over and over again with the Japanese, that the inability to grasp the current situation and to adapt.
Unlike the American Air Force, which adapts and changes and solves its problems as it faces them and becomes more and more and more deadly.
And that's the thing. One of the things I find so interesting about the war in the Pacific, the air war in the Pacific, is you see, look at what it takes years for the change to happen in Europe. And you see the change happen in months in the Pacific. I mean, you go from precision bombing's not working, firebombing, all the way up to nuclear bombing in the span of like 9 months. I mean, it's just the accelerated pace of transformation of air warfare in the Pacific.
I'm absolutely sure that's to do with the equipment they've got, the arrival of the B-29s, all the rest of it, and secondly because the war's just going on and it's time to wrap this thing
they're
up.
Ready to be done.
These bastards keep going. We need to end this, and that needs different weights. And I think in the first part of the air war, people are feeling their way still. They're kind of working out what can be done and what can't be done. By 1945, they know what can be done and what can't be done, and so I think it's a lot more clear cut.
Yeah, it's time to end this thing. Particularly when Germany's out, they're like, all right, that's it. We got to end this thing.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
Well, James, congratulations. I mean, it's a stunning piece of work. It really is.
A brilliant
book.
Thank
you, guys.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. Yeah. And thanks so much for coming on to talk to us about it. I mean, it's a horrifying story, but it also, it speaks to the fact that in the end, if you're, the moral questions about if you are going to go to war, this might be what you've got to do. Ultimately, that people had fenced around a little and tried to avoid, and that also that this, that the duet idea from the 20s is perhaps actually true, but what you need is an atomic bomb to achieve it, and that he was seeing well into the future, and the technology simply didn't exist to bring his vision about.
Yeah, absolutely.
But anyway, thank you so much for talking to us. Black Snow, James M. Scott, an extraordinary read. And thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you all again very, very soon. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.